In 2025, a London-based luggage storage company called Stasher published its annual ranking of the world's major tourist attractions, and the Hollywood Walk of Fame, 2,700 brass and terrazzo stars embedded in the sidewalks of the most famous neighborhood on Earth, came in dead last. The worst major tourist destination in the world, not a temple in a war zone, not a closed museum. Hollywood, the place that invented the American dream on celluloid, the place whose name is literally synonymous with glamour, rated below everything, everywhere, by the people who actually went there. And the most remarkable thing about that ranking is that almost nobody who heard it was surprised. To understand how that happened, you have to understand something most people never learn about Hollywood, which is that the whole place, from its very first day, was a sales pitch for something that wasn't quite there. The story begins in 1887 with a man named Harvey Henderson Wilcox. Wilcox was a Kansas prohibitionist, a man of stern religious principle, who had come west to California and purchased 150 acres of scrubland in the Cahuenga Valley, about 10 miles northwest of the small city of Los Angeles. The land was dry, flat, unremarkable, cactus and barley, and a hot wind off the mountains. Wilcox had tried ranching and failed at it, so he did what men of his era did with land they couldn't farm. He filed a subdivision map with the Los Angeles County Recorder and started selling lots. His wife, Daida, is credited with naming the development. She'd heard about a place called Hollywood somewhere back east, an estate in Illinois most likely, and thought it sounded refined. They wrote it on the deed, and that was that. The most famous place name in American history was chosen, essentially, because a woman from Kansas thought it had a nice ring. What Wilcox envisioned for Hollywood was a community that reflected his values, sober, pious, and orderly. By 1903, the town had incorporated with 88 votes for and 77 against. The following January, residents voted 113 to 96 to ban the sale of liquor. No hotel, no restaurant, not a single establishment in the new municipality of Hollywood, California, was permitted to serve wine or spirits before, during, or after a meal. This was the founding charter of the entertainment capital of the world, a place where you could not legally buy a drink. The prohibition held for 6 years. Then, in 1910, Hollywood voted itself out of existence. The town had never solved its water problem. The Cahuenga Valley was parched country, and getting a reliable municipal supply to a small independent community in the Southern California desert was expensive and difficult. Los Angeles, 10 miles to the southeast, had just secured the water rights to the Owens Valley and was building a 233-mile aqueduct to pipe mountain snowmelt to the basin. The price of access was annexation. Hollywood citizens voted to merge with Los Angeles, surrendering their independence, their name on the map, and their liquor ban all at once. The dusty Main Street, Prospect Avenue, was renamed Hollywood Boulevard, and the little temperance colony founded by a Kansas prohibitionist was absorbed into a city that was about to become one of the largest, most chaotic, and most intoxicated metropolises in America. The timing was almost supernatural. Within a year of Hollywood's annexation, the first movie studio appeared on Sunset Boulevard, a converted tavern of all things, at the southeast corner of Sunset and Gower. The man who set it up was Al Christie, general manager for a New Jersey filmmaker named David Horsley. That was 1911. By 1913, Cecil B. DeMille had arrived. By 1915, the migration was a flood. Dozens of filmmakers from the East Coast were pouring into Southern California, and the reasons were practical to the point of being mundane. 300 days of sunshine a year, varied terrain for location shooting, cheap land, cheap labor, and, this is the part that rarely gets enough emphasis, a 3,000-mile head start on Thomas Edison's lawyers. Edison held patents on most of the essential equipment for making motion pictures, and his company, the Motion Picture Patents Company, enforced those patents aggressively. Filmmakers working without a license in New York or New Jersey could expect a visit from Edison's agents. In California, they could see them coming. If things got truly bad, Mexico was a short drive south. So the movies came to Hollywood for sunshine and cheap rent and the freedom to operate outside a monopoly. Not for the culture, not for the architecture, not because the place had any particular distinction. Hollywood was, in 1911, a dusty suburb that had just lost its own name. It had no theater, no cultural institution, no civic identity beyond a single streetcar line and a few hundred houses surrounded by citrus groves and barley fields. The trip from downtown Los Angeles took 2 hours by streetcar, and the service was infrequent. The movies didn't come to Hollywood because Hollywood was special. Hollywood became special because the movies came, and they came fast. In 1910, Biograph Company, which counted among its players Lillian Gish, Mary Pickford, and Lionel Barrymore, shot a film called In Old California, generally considered the first movie made entirely in Hollywood. Within 3 years, Charlie Chaplin had built his own studio. By the early 1920s, a handful of ambitious men, Samuel Goldwyn, Carl Laemmle, William Fox, Louis B. Mayer, the four Warner brothers, had transformed a cottage industry of independent filmmakers into a cartel of industrial studios. Hollywood's population was booming. Actors and directors were making fortunes not just in pictures, but in real estate, buying land in the hills and flipping it as the next wave of arrivals pushed prices higher. The whole economy of the neighborhood was being restructured around a single industry, an industry that, it turned out, was already outgrowing the neighborhood. And here is the fact that changes the entire story. The movies didn't really stay in Hollywood either. As the studios grew from storefront operations into industrial empires through the 19-teens and 20s, they needed land, acres of it, for sound stages and backlots and processing laboratories. Hollywood, already subdivided into residential lots, couldn't offer that kind of space at the right price. So the studios spread out across the Los Angeles basin. Warner Brothers built its main facility in Burbank in 1926. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer set up in Culver City. Universal went to the San Fernando Valley, to a place that would literally be named Universal City. 20th Century Fox took a spread in West Los Angeles. Of the big 5 studios that would dominate the golden age of Hollywood, Paramount, Warner Brothers, MGM, RKO, and Fox, exactly 1 maintained its primary lot within the actual boundaries of the Hollywood neighborhood. That was Paramount on Melrose Avenue, where it remains to this day. 1 out of 5. The other 4 were somewhere else entirely, making films under the Hollywood name from addresses that were, in some cases, a 40-minute drive from Hollywood Boulevard. This is the foundational irony of the place, and everything that came later grows from it. Hollywood was never really where the movies were made. It was where the movies were sold. The neighborhood itself, a few blocks of Boulevard, a handful of theaters, a couple of famous hotels, was the showroom. The factory was always somewhere else. The 5 studios and their 3 smaller siblings, Universal, Columbia, and United Artists, collectively controlled production, distribution, and exhibition of nearly every film Americans saw. At its peak in the mid-1940s, the industry was selling roughly 90 million tickets a week to a country of 140 million people. The revenue was staggering, and almost none of the production infrastructure that generated it was physically in Hollywood. But what a showroom it was. The man most responsible for building it was Charles E. Toberman, a Texas-born real estate developer who arrived in Hollywood in the early 1900s and spent the next 5 decades turning a residential district into a stage set for the movie industry's public face. Toberman, who would live to be 101, dying in 1981, built or financed an extraordinary string of landmarks. The Hollywood Bowl, the Roosevelt Hotel, the El Capitan Theater, the Egyptian Theater, and most famously, Grauman's Chinese Theater. He placed 53 Hollywood subdivisions on the market. He formed more than 30 companies. He built 29 commercial buildings. The locals called him Mr. Hollywood, and the title was earned. If H.J. Whitley was the father of Hollywood, the man who bought the land, installed the electricity, opened the first hotel. Then Toberman was the architect of its public identity, the man who understood that the neighborhood's future wasn't in houses, but in spectacle. The spectacle began in 1922, when showman Sid Grauman opened his Egyptian Theater on Hollywood Boulevard, the first major premier house in the neighborhood. Grauman was a former gold miner turned impresario who had previously built the $1 million theater downtown, which, in a characteristic bit of Hollywood inflation, actually cost $800,000. The Egyptian, designed by the firm of Meyer and Holler for Toberman, was a movie palace built in the exotic revival style. a vast theatrical interpretation of Egyptian architecture, with hieroglyphics and pharaonic columns, timed to coincide with the worldwide mania over the discovery of King Tut's tomb. Premieres at the Egyptian became events. Limousines would line up on the Boulevard. Searchlights would sweep the sky. The whole apparatus of Hollywood glamour, the red carpet, the flashbulbs, the screaming fans, was essentially invented on this one block. 4 years later, Toberman opened the El Capitan Theater a few doors west, a 6-story building, the tallest in Hollywood at the time, and the first to be air-conditioned, housing a legitimate stage theater designed by G. Albert Landsberg in an ornate East Indian style. The building cost Toberman a small fortune. It opened on May 3, 1926, with a live theatrical production before Disney eventually converted it into the movie house it remains today. 5 years later, Grauman topped himself. Working with Toberman, Joseph Schenck, Mary Pickford, and Douglas Fairbanks, he built Grauman's Chinese Theater a few blocks west at 6925 Hollywood Boulevard. It cost $2 million, $30 million in today's money. The architect, Raymond M. Kennedy of Meyer and Holler, designed it as a giant red pagoda flanked by stone lion dogs and crowned with a bronze roof. The U.S. government had to grant special authorization to import temple bells, pagodas, and carved stone artifacts from China. Chinese artisans worked on site under the supervision of poet and director Moon Quan. The theater opened on May 18, 1927, with the premiere of Cecil B. DeMille's The King of Kings. The crowd was enormous. An estimated 30,000 people showed up for a theater that seated about 2,000. Klieg lights raked the sky. The forecourt, decorated with statuary created by Chinese artisans on site, glowed under the Southern California evening. For one night, on one block of Hollywood Boulevard, the gap between the myth and the place closed completely. And then the accident happened, or the publicity stunt, depending on which version you believe. Sometime during or just after construction, Sid Grauman stepped in wet cement in the forecourt. According to the most widely told version, he called Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford to come add their own handprints and footprints to the mess. The cement was nearly dry by the time they arrived. The impressions were too faint. A few weeks later, they were formally invited back to do it properly. Norma Talmadge added hers a few days after, and just like that, a tradition was born. The forecourt of the stars, celebrities pressing their hands and feet into wet concrete, became one of the most visited attractions in America, an ingenious piece of marketing that cost almost nothing and drew millions. It was, in its way, the most Hollywood thing Hollywood ever produced. An accident turned into a brand. All of this was happening in the orbit of the Hollywood Hotel, the building that had been the neighborhood's social center since 1902, when H.J. Whitley built it on the corner of Prospect Avenue and Highland to attract buyers to his land development. The hotel had started as a 50-room mission revival structure, built for $30,000. Over the years, it grew to 250 rooms. Almira Hershey, a wealthy businesswoman, bought it in 1906 and turned it into the place to be seen in early Hollywood. Thursday night dances in the ballroom became legendary. It was at one of those Thursday dances, the story goes, that a young Italian immigrant named Rodolfo Guglielmi was spotted teaching the tango to a screenwriter named June Matisse. He would become Rudolph Valentino. He lived in room 264. He married his first wife there. He honeymooned there. For years after his death in 1926, tourists asked to stay in his room. One wag observed that eventually every room in the hotel had supposedly been Valentino's. The hotel had another feature worth remembering. To mark where certain regular guests sat in the dining room, the management painted stars, golden stars, with names inscribed, on the ceiling above their tables. Valentino had one. Norma Shearer had one. John Gilbert, Eleanor Glynn, Ethel Barrymore. Stars on a ceiling, marking where the famous people sat. Hold that image. Meanwhile, up in the hills above the neighborhood, another piece of salesmanship was going up. In 1923, a syndicate of real estate developers, S.H. Woodruff and Tracy E. Schultz, backed by Los Angeles Times publisher Harry Chandler, was building a housing development called Hollywoodland in the steep canyons below Mount Lee. To advertise the lots to drivers and streetcar riders in the basin below, They hired the Crescent Sign Company to erect a temporary sign on the ridge. The designer, Thomas Fisk Goff, built 13 enormous letters, each about 50 feet tall and 30 feet wide, faced with sheet metal and studded with roughly 4,000 light bulbs. At night, the letters flashed in sequence: Holly, then wood, then land, then the whole word at once, with a searchlight sweeping below. The cost was $21,000, equivalent to somewhere between $300,000 and $500,000 today. It was supposed to last 18 months. That was over 100 years ago. The sign is still there. The 1920s and 30s were the peak, the years when the showroom and the factory were closest to being the same thing, when Hollywood Boulevard was genuinely the center of the film world's public life. The studios held their premieres there. The stars lived nearby. In Whitley Heights, a Mediterranean-inspired hillside development that Toberman had built above Highland Avenue, and in the grand apartment buildings along Franklin Avenue where young actors shared rooms and rehearsed in basements. The restaurants were real restaurants where real deals happened. Musso and Frank Grill, which opened in 1919 on Hollywood Boulevard and served its steaks and martinis to Chaplin, Fitzgerald, Faulkner, and Chandler at dark wooden booths that haven't changed in a century. The Brown Derby on Vine Street, shaped like an enormous hat. The Trocadero on the Sunset Strip. The Garden of Allah, a West Hollywood apartment complex owned by silent film star Alla Nazimova, where at various times F. Scott Fitzgerald, the Marx Brothers, Marlene Dietrich, Humphrey Bogart, Errol Flynn, and Orson Welles took up residence. A single address that held more talent per square foot than most cities have ever produced. In October 1934, the columnist Luella Parsons launched a radio show called Hollywood Hotel, broadcast from the actual Hollywood Hotel, that put movie stars on live radio for the first time. It was the first major network show broadcast from the West Coast, and it extended the mythology of the place to every living room in America with a radio set. By 1937, the show's sponsor, Campbell's Soup, was paying $3,000 per episode, a fortune for radio, and Parsons wielded her microphone like a scepter, knowing that a kind word from her could make a career and a cruel one could end it. But even during the golden age, the real power was elsewhere. The deals were made at the studios, in Burbank, in Culver City, on the Paramount lot on Melrose. The stars were moving to Beverly Hills, which had successfully resisted annexation by Los Angeles in 1923, led, in a rich irony, by Mary Pickford and other Hollywood figures who understood that the best way to profit from Hollywood was to live somewhere else. The vote was close. The 850 residents of Beverly Hills chose independence over water security, the opposite of what Hollywood had done 13 years earlier, and the difference defined both communities for a century. Beverly Hills stayed exclusive, manicured, controlled. Hollywood became part of the city and subject to the city's forces. Sprawl, neglect, political indifference, the thousand small decisions that turn a neighborhood into a pass-through. The crack came in 1948, and it came from Washington. On May 4th, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down its decision in United States versus Paramount Pictures, a case that had been grinding through the courts since 1938. The ruling was devastating. The 5 major studios, Paramount, Warner Brothers, MGM, RKO, and Fox, had built their empires on vertical integration. They produced the films, distributed the films, and owned the theaters that showed the films. They could block book their pictures, forcing independent theater owners to buy an entire slate of movies just to get the few hits they wanted. The court ruled this was an antitrust violation and ordered the studios to divest their theater chains. RKO went first, signing a consent decree in November 1948. Paramount followed in 1949. The others eventually fell in line. The Paramount decision didn't destroy Hollywood overnight, but it broke the economic engine that had made the studio system work. Without guaranteed exhibition, the studios had to compete for every screen. Production costs rose, risk increased. The number of films produced each year dropped sharply. Studios that had released 50 pictures a year cut their slates in half. Contract players, the stable of actors who had drawn weekly salaries, whether they were in a picture or not, were let go. The ancillary businesses that had depended on a constant flow of production, costume houses, prop shops, catering companies, The small army of carpenters and electricians and painters who maintained the lots contracted. And then, in the early 1950s, television arrived, and Paramount, blocked from buying into the new medium by its antitrust entanglements, watched its competitor become a living room fixture in every American home. NBC, which had maintained studios in Hollywood since the radio era, moved its West Coast television operations to a custom-built facility in Burbank in 1955, the first studio designed specifically for color television. Even television, the industry Hollywood was losing to, chose not to stay in Hollywood. By 1960, weekly movie attendance in the United States had fallen from its 1946 peak of roughly 90 million to about 40 million. The golden age was over. Hollywood, the neighborhood, felt it first. The stars had already left for Beverly Hills and Bel Air. The studios, all except Paramount, had never really been there. What remained was the Boulevard, the theaters, the hotels, and the myth. And now the myth was fading. In 1956, the Hollywood Hotel was demolished. Charles Toberman, the same man who had built Grauman's Chinese, the same man who had shaped the Boulevard's identity for 40 years, had acquired the hotel in the early 1940s with plans to redevelop the block. World War II restrictions on building materials stopped him. A decade later, nothing did. The old hotel, where Valentino had danced the tango and married Jean Acker in 1919 and honeymooned in room 264, where Luella Parsons had broadcast to the nation and the stars' names had been painted on the ceiling above their regular tables, was razed. By the end, the hotel was shabby, outmoded. Its deep wraparound porch, once the social center of the film world, was a relic of a slower era. But it was occupied. A 12-story savings and loan building went up in its place. The guest ledger went to the Smithsonian. Two of the hotel's famous trees were replanted at the Hollywood Bowl. Till the end, the hotel had been nearly fully occupied, many of its residents elderly people who had lived there for decades. One of them, asked about leaving, said, "I don't want to go to heaven. I want to stay here." That savings and loan building would itself be demolished in 1998 to make way for Hollywood and Highland. 3 buildings on the same lot in a century, each one larger and more expensive than the last, each one trying to recapture something the previous one had and lost. 4 years later, in 1960, the Walk of Fame was born. E.M. Stewart, a volunteer president of the Hollywood Chamber of Commerce, had floated the idea back in 1953, when the Boulevard was already showing signs of strain. The concept was straightforward. Embed permanent stars in the sidewalk, one for each honoree, pink terrazzo rimmed in bronze. Construction began in February 1960. The first permanent star, laid on March 28th, honored producer and director Stanley Kramer. By that November, the project was far enough along to hold a dedication ceremony in conjunction with the Hollywood Christmas Parade. Over 1,500 stars were installed in those first 16 months. The Walk of Fame is usually presented as a celebration, but consider the timing. It arrived in 1960, just as the studio system was collapsing, just as television was pulling audiences out of theaters, just as the stars were scattering to suburbs, and the industry was beginning its long dispersal. The Walk wasn't a monument to a living culture. It was a preservation effort, an attempt to fix in bronze and stone what was already slipping away. Those painted stars on the ceiling of the demolished Hollywood Hotel, the ones that marked where Valentino and Shearer and Barrymore had sat, the Walk of Fame was their echo, scaled up to 15 blocks of sidewalk, an entire neighborhood turned into a memorial to its own past. Through the 1960s, the decline accelerated. The old movie palaces, built for a world where a premiere was a civic event, struggled to fill seats. Smaller theaters closed or converted to grindhouses showing exploitation films around the clock. Retail shifted to shopping malls in the suburbs. Westfield Fashion Square opened in the Valley in 1962, Beverly Center in 1982, and the Boulevard storefronts cycled through discount shops and souvenir stands. The apartment buildings that had once housed aspiring actors now housed anyone who could make rent, and rents were falling. By the 1970s, Hollywood Boulevard had become a place that people who remembered its golden age could barely recognize. Sex shops replaced jewelers. Massage parlors with blacked-out windows opened on blocks where Luella Parsons had once held court. Drug dealers worked corners that had once hosted searchlight premieres. The LAPD's Hollywood division became one of the busiest in the city. In 1971, a photographer named Ave Pildes, who had been an art director at Capitol Records just up the street, started walking the boulevard with his camera. He photographed hippies, hustlers, addicts, transvestites posing next to Judy Garland's star on the Walk of Fame, and people dressed to the nines in the middle of the day, either left over from the night before, he recalled, or because they were on their way to an audition. He took thousands of pictures. Then he put them away for 40 years. When they were finally exhibited in 2013 at a gallery on the very street where they'd been taken, people looked at them the way you look at photographs of a relative who was beautiful once and didn't know it. Up on the hill, the sign was falling apart. The wooden letters, never meant to be permanent, had been rotting for decades. The caretaker who had once replaced the bulbs was long gone. By the 1970s, the third O had toppled down the mountainside. An arsonist had set fire to the bottom of the second L. The top of the D was gone. What remained read, depending on the angle, something like Hollywood, a broken word on a brown hillside, visible for miles, advertising nothing. In 1973, the city of Los Angeles declared the sign a cultural historic landmark, Monument number 111, and Gloria Swanson, the silent film star, aged 74, hosted the dedication ceremony. A thick fog rolled in. Nobody could see the sign. The whole episode reads like a scene from a movie about decline that the old Hollywood would have been too proud to make. The sign was eventually rebuilt in 1978, funded by celebrity donors including Alice Cooper, who paid for the last O, Hugh Hefner, who sponsored the Y, and Gene Autry, the singing cowboy, who took the second L. Each letter cost $27,500, a total of $249,000 for 9 letters. The new sign was steel, not wood. It was built to last, but the neighborhood below it was still unraveling. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, Hollywood Boulevard bottomed out. Crime reached new highs. The Egyptian Theater, where the very first Hollywood premiere had taken place in 1922, closed its doors. Theaters that had once screened Ben-Hur and Gone with the Wind showed kung fu double features to half-empty rooms or shut down entirely. Storefronts went vacant. The boulevard's reputation became a national punchline, the place people mentioned when they wanted to illustrate the distance between an American promise and an American reality. The attempted rescue arrived at the turn of the millennium, and it was massive. In the late 1990s, a Canadian developer called Trizek Hahn proposed a project so ambitious it seemed either visionary or delusional. A $615 million retail and entertainment complex at the intersection of Hollywood Boulevard and Highland Avenue, the exact site where the Hollywood Hotel had stood. The city of Los Angeles, through its Community Redevelopment Agency, contributed at least $90 million in public funds. McCarthy Building Companies excavated 650,000 cubic yards of dirt from a 75-foot deep hole, poured 72,000 cubic yards of concrete, and installed 12,000 tons of structural steel. At peak construction, 900 workers operated 7 days a week. The centerpiece was an auditorium designed to be the permanent home of the Academy Awards, the Kodak Theater, later the Dolby Theater. The courtyard was designed in a Babylonian motif, inspired by the sets of D.W. Griffith's 1916 film Intolerance, complete with replica elephant sculptures atop massive columns. Hollywood and Highland opened on November 9, 2001, 7 weeks after September 11th, into a national economy in shock and a travel industry in freefall. Within 3 years, the developer had sold the property to CIM Group for a reported price well under half of the $615 million it cost to build. CIM renovated, repositioned, brought in higher-end tenants. In 2019, they sold it again to a joint venture of San Jose-based DJM Capital Partners and Hong Kong-based GAW Capital for $325 million. The new owners spent another $100 million on renovations. They tore out the Babylonian elephants, scrapped the intolerance theme, redesigned the courtyard, and renamed the whole thing Ovation Hollywood. It opened under its third name in 2022. 3 names, 3 owners, over $700 million in total construction and renovation. all on the same 8 acres where H.J. Whitley's $30,000 hotel once stood, where the painted stars on the ceiling marked Valentino's table. The Oscars still happen there, the Chinese theater still operates, sold to a Chinese electronics company, TCL, which put its name on the marquee. Paramount is still on Melrose, the last major studio in Hollywood proper, though in early 2026 reports emerged that a merger with Warner Brothers Discovery could put even that storied lot's future into question. The Walk of Fame still draws millions, but the reviews those millions leave behind tell a story that no amount of renovation has been able to fix. Dirty sidewalks, overpriced restaurants, and countless homeless people cloud the experience. That's a TripAdvisor review, one of thousands in the same register. We didn't feel safe during the day. It is not at all as it is portrayed in films. The Hollywood sign was really only disappointment. You can't go there, and they are much smaller than they look in real life. I wanted to show my kids a highlight of what America can be, but this is a really bad disappointment. One visitor from a small country town, with no electricity and running water, they specified, said the boulevard smelled worse than anything they'd grown up around. These reviews are not anomalies. They are the consensus. And the reason is not complicated once you see it. Hollywood has always been a place that sold an experience it couldn't quite deliver, because the experience was never really located there. The studios were in Burbank and Culver City. The stars were in Beverly Hills and Bel Air. The movies were shot, increasingly over the decades, in Georgia, New Mexico, Canada, the United Kingdom, anywhere that offered a better tax deal. Between 2015 and 2020 alone, productions denied California tax credits took $7.7 billion in economic activity to other states and countries. Georgia took $551 million. Canada took $1.2 billion. In the fourth quarter of 2025, California saw a 20% year-over-year decline in film and television projects shooting in the state. The industry that gave Hollywood its name now increasingly operates on a different continent. What is left on the boulevard is the residue of the brand. The sidewalk stars, the handprints in cement, the tchotchke shops, the costume performers in cheap superhero suits who pose for tips and become aggressive when the tips don't come. The infrastructure of pilgrimage without the thing that was being pilgrimaged to. People come from all over the world because the name means something. It means movies. It means glamour. It means the dream. And what they find is a 15-block stretch of sidewalk where someone in a stained Spider-Man costume asks them for $5, and the nearest actual movie set is a 40-minute drive through traffic. The irony is precise. Georgia, a state with no historical connection to filmmaking whatsoever, now hosts more major film and television production than California. Georgia spent an estimated $1.35 billion in film tax credits in a recent year. California's cap, until Governor Newsom doubled it in 2024, was $330 million. The market spoke. It said Hollywood was a name, not a place. The boulevard is getting another makeover. Plans are underway to revamp a 3.6-mile stretch, eliminating traffic lanes, widening sidewalks, adding bike lanes, replacing broken streetlights with historically inspired vintage fixtures, possibly moving toward a pedestrian-only boulevard that city planners have floated, on and off, for years. The Hollywood Partnership, which represents nearly 500 retailers in the area, dispatches cleaning crews who scrub the bronze stars on the Walk of Fame and haul away the debris that accumulates overnight. The estimated cost of the latest renovation is about $8 million, a rounding error compared to what's been spent before. Kathleen Rawson, the partnership's president, has called it a turning point. She noted that investment dollars have poured into downtown Los Angeles for years, while Hollywood's infrastructure has been starved. It has been decades since Hollywood has seen major infrastructure funds, she told the press, with the particular weariness of someone who has been explaining the same problem for a long time. Turning points have been declared on Hollywood Boulevard approximately once a decade since the 1960s. The boulevard has been turning for 60 years and has not yet arrived anywhere the tourists want to be. The deeper problem is one that no renovation can solve because it is built into the place's DNA. Hollywood was never a city that developed an industry and then lost it, the way Pittsburgh lost steel or Detroit lost auto manufacturing. Those cities had something real that went away. Hollywood had something real that was never quite there, Or rather, it was there for about 20 years, from roughly 1920 to 1940, when the boulevard and the industry genuinely occupied the same geography, when Sid Grauman's premieres and Valentino's Thursday night tangos and the star-painted ceiling of the Hollywood Hotel were all happening in the same few blocks where the movies were actually being planned and financed and cast. That was the golden age. It was real, but it was brief, and what replaced it was the name, the brand, which turned out to be far more durable than the thing it described. The Hollywoodland sign understood this from the beginning. It was a $21,000 billboard for a real estate development, designed by a sign maker, hauled up a mountain by mules, studded with 4,000 8-watt bulbs, and intended to stand for a year and a half. It advertised a subdivision, not an art form. It was commerce dressed as spectacle, which is, if you think about it, the most honest description of Hollywood anyone has ever put on a hillside. The developers went away. The subdivision is still there, a quiet residential neighborhood with a homeowners association. The sign decayed, was patched, collapsed, was rebuilt in steel. The land was stripped off in 1949, turning a real estate ad into something that looked like a declaration of identity, Hollywood, as if the word were a place, as if the place were still the word. Today, the sign is maintained by a 9-member volunteer trust appointed by the Hollywood Chamber of Commerce. A surveillance system monitors it around the clock. It was repainted in 2023 for its 100th anniversary. From below, from the courtyard of Ovation Hollywood, standing where the Hollywood Hotel stood, where Valentino's room was, where the stars on the ceiling slowly gathered dust before the wrecking ball came, you can look up through a designed archway and see the white letters on the brown mountain. The developers spent $100 million in part to frame that view. An archway built in 2022 to showcase a sign built in 1923 to sell houses that were built in 1924. One sales pitch framing another sales pitch, a century apart, and between them, the entire history of a place that got famous by telling the world it was something it wasn't quite, and then spent 100 years trying to become the thing it had already told everyone it was. The stars are still in the sidewalk, 2,846 of them, as of the spring of 2026, and a new one costs $50,000. Paid not by the city, not by the honoree, but by whoever nominates them. Usually a studio or a label looking for a publicity event. $50,000 for a terrazzo star in a sidewalk that a luggage storage company in London has rated the worst tourist attraction on the planet. In 1980, when the nomination fee was first instituted, it was $2,500. The price has risen 20-fold. The reviews have gone in the opposite direction. At the Chinese Theater, the TCL Chinese Theater, as the marquee now reads, you can still see the handprints. Mary Pickford's, Douglas Fairbanks's, Norma Talmadge's from those first days in 1927. The cement is original. A movie ticket cost 75 cents when the theater opened. Today, an IMAX 3D showing costs $22.75. The forecourt is free. People still line up, still kneel down, still press their hands into the impressions left by actors who have been dead for half a century or more. It is, in its strange way, the most genuine thing on the boulevard. Not a reproduction, not a renovation, not a brand exercise, but actual concrete that actual famous people actually touched, preserved in the open air for anyone to see. The only attraction in Hollywood that delivers exactly what it promises, proof that someone was here. The rest is the gap between the name and the place, the sign and the city, the dream and the boulevard, a gap that has been Hollywood's engine and Hollywood's curse since a Kansas prohibitionist named his ranch after a town in Illinois, and a sign company hauled 4,000 light bulbs up a mountain to sell houses that hadn't been built yet. The bulbs burned out decades ago. The houses are still there. The sign is still there. The tourists are still coming, 10 million a year, and most of them leave disappointed because they came looking for Hollywood, and what they found was a neighborhood.